Hey folks, here's your second video of the day. Today we're going to be talking about the anatomy of the humerus. Now for the humerus, we're going to take a look at the proximal end first, and then we'll finish up with the distal end. So first thing you need to know is the head of the humerus. That's what's going to make a joint with the glenoid fossa, and that will be covered with articular cartilage, which is why we have a little bit of a different texture in this drawing here. Right next to the head of the humerus, almost where the articular cartilage stops, is a portion called the anatomical neck. And so I just drew a blue line there. The anatomical neck, many of your long bones will have both a head that fits into the joint and a neck. For the humerus, we have a little bit of a different situation. It's called the anatomical neck rather than just the neck, because down here where the diaphysis kind of begins, we have a section that became known as the surgical neck. So FYI, that's why this is known as the anatomical neck. That's the only time we're going to see that word anatomical in front of neck. In the vicinity of this, these two parts that I've just mentioned, we have two distinct bumps. And again, I know this is a flat diagram, so it's kind of hard for you to see without the model, but this bump right out here is a humongous muscle attachment site for your shoulder, the muscles that move your humerus in various directions, and that spot is called the greater tubercle. Tubercle is really just kind of a fancy way to say a bump, just like a lot of the other words that we have mean bump. And so this is a much, I wouldn't say it's much larger, but it's larger than the second part of the humerus, and this is always going to be on the anterior surface right here. That's known as the lesser tubercle. So greater tubercle is bigger, lesser tubercle is smaller. We've seen that word tubercle before on the rib. Between the two, and in a minute I'll show you some actual humerus pictures to try to illustrate this point a little better, is a pretty significant groove. Because it's between the two tubercles, we're going to use our prefix for between, which is inter, and call that the intertubercular groove. Now, there's a couple different names for it. Maybe if you've taken the care and preventions class with Tim, you've seen, what does he call it? Bicipital groove, because it has the biceps tendon in it. It's the same thing. Intertubercular groove. So greater tubercle, lesser tubercle, between the two, a groove known as the intertubercular groove. A little bit further down, about mid-shaft of the humerus, is a area that's really just kind of looks like a roughened patch, and that's known as the deltoid tuberosity. A tuberosity is described as a roughened raised projection for muscle attachment. Honestly, there's not a huge distinction between tuberosity and tubercle. So you may sometimes hear other people interchanging these words, but for us, these are tubercles. This is a tuberosity, and we'll see this again a lot. The muscle that's attaching there is the deltoid. And unless you have an actual real skeleton in front of you, it's pretty hard to find on our little budget models. They didn't do a great job with that. It's not a humongous, amazing part that sticks off and is super obvious, but we'll see that in class. Let's take a look at the posterior view, and we'll kind of copy our answers over to this side. So here's the head, and right next to it you can see how it does narrow a little bit, just a tiny bit. That's going to be called the anatomical neck again. And from the posterior view, we can really get a better look on how much of a projection this greater tubercle is. So there's the greater tubercle, same colors as before. The lesser tubercle is unseen in this view because it's on the anterior surface. And then this also is a little bit better view of the deltoid tuberosity. You can see something special is going on there, and that's where the deltoid muscle is going to insert onto the bone. All right, distal end, it gets a little tricky, so go slow with this. Remember, we have two bones that are going to make a joint with the distal end of the humerus. We have the radius and the ulna. The radius is always positioned laterally in anatomical position, and for this arm that we're looking at, oops, let me go back. For this arm that we're looking at, the radius is going to be hanging right underneath here. Right next to it, taking up this spot right here, will be the ulna. So go ahead and write little tiny words, radius underneath this one little circle, and ulna underneath these two bumps. And when we progress onto the lower arm bones, that'll make a little bit more sense. This whole section down here on the distal end will make a lot more sense when we get to the radius and ulna, because we have a lot of similar parts that are fitting together and they have similar names. All right, so the first one that I want you to mark on your notes is the coronoid fossa. It is a shallow depression, and when your ulna makes a joint with the humerus and you bend your elbow, there's a tip of the ulna that's going to fit into this fossa. So if this wasn't there, you would not be able to bend your elbow as far as you can. So coronoid fossa right there. It's the more medial of the two. And then we have a much, much smaller radial fossa on the lateral aspect, so that when you bend, the head of the radius bone is going to fit right up into that little fossa. Okay, and those are indentations that are allowing those bony parts to fit together when you bend your elbow. Again, make more sense when we get to the lower arm bones. Right underneath the radial fossa is a portion of the humerus called the capitulum, and the head of the radius will directly form a joint with this portion called the capitulum. Okay, and I'll give you a way to remember that when we get to the lower arm. This thing right here, I feel, is one of the more notable features of the distal humerus, and that thing right there is, which also, like the capitulum, will be covered in articular cartilage, is known as the trochlea. And that means spool. So apparently anatomists thought this looked like a little spool. I guess if you turn a spool of thread sideways, maybe that's what the deal was. So there's the trochlea, and then two more parts on this anterior view and we're almost done. Just a note, both the capitulum and the trochlea are the condyles of the humerus. So technically, if we split this humerus into, let's say, halves, those are going to act as the condyles of the humerus. If you have your little half sheet, your cheat sheet of definitions, a condyle, like we saw in the mandible and on the occipital bone, a condyle is a knuckle-shaped bump that forms a joint, and I guess, you can see these look like little knuckles if you make a fist. It almost looks like a little fist. So these would be the knuckles that make the joint. That being said, there are bumps upon a condyle. If you look on your cheat sheet, you'll find that word, and that's known as an epicondyle. An epicondyle is not for joint formation. It is for something other than a bone to attach. So maybe it's a ligament, maybe it's a tendon, but something is attaching to the epicondyles, and so we have both a lateral epicondyle and a medial epicondyle. And you'll notice that medial epicondyle is significantly larger than the lateral, and actually it's something that you can feel very easily on the medial aspect of your elbow. It's not your elbow point directly on the posterior surface, it's on the medial aspect, and we call it the funny bone. So let's progress to the posterior side of the distal humerus, and there's our deltoid tuberosity from before. There's that huge medial epicondyle. So this is a right arm, we just flipped it over to the back. There's the lateral over there. So we'll go ahead and add those two in. You can see the medial one is just waiting for you to hit it on something. And we have a nerve that runs right in this groove behind called the ulnar nerve. And that's why you feel that like horrible funny feeling that goes down to your ring finger and pinky finger, because that's where the ulnar nerve goes. So you irritate the nerve when you hit your funny bone. We see again in this view the trochlea. It looks a lot more spool-like from the back, but what's essentially missing from this back view is that capitulum. And so if you have your hand in the anatomical position, the capitulum would be kind of on the other side of the bone. It would be about here on the lateral side, because radius is always lateral, capitulum meets the radius. Our final landmark is called, this is a great word, the olecranon fossa. And the olecranon is actually a part of the ulna that will fit into the olecranon fossa. So again, I know this is a lot for now, but it will make 100% more sense once we get into the radius and ulna. Okay, we're going to use a lot of these words again. So there's the olecranon fossa. That's a pretty good indicator. You're looking at the posterior view versus the anterior view, which you would see both the coronoid and radial fossas. All right.
Okay, so within the app, let's see what we can see. Obviously, we see the scapula here and the clavicle here and the humerus here. And as I get closer, the head of the humerus is very obvious in this atlas. It's going to be here, and it's almost as if they've covered it with articular cartilage. So that's the head. The anatomical neck is going to be right where the cartilage ends. And remember, we call it the anatomical neck because this area here is the surgical neck. If a lot of times people break the humerus, it's right in this vicinity. All right, so we're going to have to kind of twist and tip. I'm not in love with the way that they have these tubercles. And I'll show you, but then I'm going to show you an actual photograph of a real humerus. So this is the greater tubercle area. Then we have a slight groove and a lesser tubercle. It should be much more obvious. So let me show you a better photo that illustrates that.
Okay, so you can see the yellow is the greater tubercle. It's larger than it looks because it wraps around the side. Green is the lesser, and between the two, the groove is the intertubercular groove.
Okay, so moving down, again, they didn't really illustrate the deltoid tuberosity too much. Oh, kind of. I'm seeing it right here. And it is a roughened raised projection for the deltoid muscle. So on real bones, it's much more obvious. And then let's look at this distal humerus here. Keep in mind this is a right arm anterior view. So this bone is the radius and this bone is the ulna. And initially I was telling you underneath this one circle is where the radius fits, so you can actually see that. And then this part right here is the trochlea, and under that is the ulna. So this is the capitulum, and this is the trochlea. And then we know that there's two fossa that are right here, one small one and one medium one. So if we put this in line, and I'll show you this in an animation in just a second, this is the radial fossa. Because when we bend our elbow, this radial head right here will fit into that spot. And this will make a little bit more sense next time, but this is called the coronoid fossa. And this little pointy part of the ulna will fit into that when we bend our elbow. So just keep everything radius on the lateral aspect. This is the radius bone, this is the capitulum, and this is the radial fossa. Over here we also have the very teeny tiny lateral epicondyle. And epicondyle means a bump upon a condyle, which is just another bump. So here's our original condyle. We just happen to call it the capitulum. And then the epicondyle. Here's our original condyle. We call it the trochlea. And the epicondyle here. This is the largest epicondyle we have. This is the medial epicondyle. Now, if I turn this around to the back, posterior view, I wanted to see if we could see that ulnar nerve. There it is. That's the nerve that we hit when we hit our quote-unquote funny bone, which is the medial epicondyle. So this nerve gets kind of squished there, and it does not care for that. See? Ulnar nerve. Okay, so in this back view, let me turn it a little bit. I'm going to delete my ulna. Okay, see, I'm deleting the ulna. Now we can actually see what we need to see. Here's the medial epicondyle. Lateral would be this barely bump over here. Doesn't even look like anything. Then here's what we can see of the trochlea, and we can see it now that the ulna's gone. Capitulum not visible from the back. This big fossa, olecranon fossa. And I'm going to show you an animation where the elbow is sort of straightening and bending so you can see how those fit together.
Okay, so I have this animation app that I can modify to show you. So we're looking at the elbow. I've got it like partially bent here. See how the radius fits into the radial fossa when we bend? That's on the lateral aspect. Now we're looking more at the ulna, how it would fit into the fossas on the humerus. So those two divots at the bottom are so we can bend our elbow the whole way. Let me turn this around to the back and I'll show you what happens when we straighten. Because the same thing happening kind of on the back. So there's the humerus, and when I bend the elbow, the olecranon fossa is visible, but when I straighten, it gets filled in. So those divots are there so that we can bend and straighten our arm fully.